Hi and welcome back to the Academy of Historical Fencing and another video in the Sword Study series. I'm Nick Thomas and today I'm going to bring you a video, an in-depth analysis on the 1804 Royal Navy Cutlass, that is the British Royal Navy Cutlass. So we get a lot of requests based on the photos and videos that we've shown of cutlasses to look more at this one, so I thought it would be a good one to do as the second one in this video series, particularly as the Cutlass is a weapon that isn't particularly well understood, I would say. Mainly because people have watched movies and have got an idea of what a cutlass is from the movies. And for a start, what that usually means is something like this, very, very short, curved and quite broad, sometimes often way more curved than this, more like a lot of more wildly curved sabres. Basically the classic pirate cutlass, if you imagine. Now, that form, if you like, let's call it the pirate cutlass because it's in every pirate movie that you've ever seen, is actually legit, and that actually was that kind of sort of small curved short sword was actually popular as a form of cutlass or hanger or couteau and the various other terms that you use for them. But this is a training sword that I recently acquired and is unusually short, and even though it has the guard similar to an 1804 Royal Navy Cutlass, the blade is wildly different. So if I now put that out of shot, so we've got that over with. So the Royal Navy 1804 Cutlass is the most famous, most iconic of the British cutlasses, and that's realistically because even though we call it the 1804, which is the year that it was accepted as a regulation, this kind of cutlass was in use well before, so throughout much of the 18th century, and was therefore, of course, the cutlass that was in use during famous battles such as Trafalgar, and therefore there is huge interest in this form of cutlass. So it is probably the most iconic, most famous of the British cutlasses. And yet, it is nothing like you imagine a pirate cutlass to be. Maybe the hilt isn't so different, but the blade is. So the blade is actually a lot longer than you would imagine. It's very close to, in fact, it's about the same length as many infantry officer sabres of the Napoleonic period. So traditionally we think of the cutlass as very small and the sabre as far larger, and in actual fact there's a massive crossover where they're exactly the same in that particular period. So the sabres were, infantry sabres that is, were quite short and the cutlasses were quite long. And also you notice that it is absolutely dead straight. So what you have here, well, you actually have a backsword. You wouldn't call this sword ever a backsword, but in construction that's exactly what it is. If it was just maybe 2 or 3 inches longer again, you would definitely then call it a backsword. And by that I mean it is a single-edged blade, so it has a completely blunt back edge and then a sharpened front edge. So it is a back edge construction, dead straight, and a lot longer than most people would think of as a cutlass. And if you see it here beside some other antiques contemporary to it, you'll see that it's as long or longer than many infantry officers' sabres, and not far off the length of the spadroon, which the spadroon in its era was actually quite long for a sword used on foot. So the term cutlass, it comes from the French couteau, which, don't get me on the pronunciation of that because I'm not a French speaker. That comes from the Latin and it basically means a small knife. And you can see the intention there is that cutlass means a small sword, if you like. And the term cutlass was generally used in the naval circles for a short sword used on ships, whereas on land the term was usually a hanger. So they can actually be the same kind of sword, a hanger and a cutlass, but cutlass is the term at sea and a hanger the one on land, although there was a bit of crossover as well. So the first thing I'd like to talk about with this cutlass, because it's the unusual feature, at least as far as popular culture is concerned, is the length of it. So traditionally people think of the cutlasses as very, very short. So this particular example you can see is close to 29 inches. It's a 73 centimetre blade, about 28 3/4 inches. And so these 1804 cutlasses, they had a regulation length of 28 to 29 inch. So you can see mine is completely typical. And a 28 to 29 inch blade, again, for the period, bear in mind this is a cutlass that was in use in basically the same form well before this period and well after, when I talk about the 1804. So 28 to 29 inch, well, most infantry officer sabres were somewhere between 27 and 30. So this is already the same length as many infantry officer sabres, and in fact longer than some. And spadroons by regulation were 32 inch, although they often came up just a little bit short. And so it's actually not far off the length of a spadroon, and it is as long or longer than many, but not all, infantry officer sabres. So already it's a lot longer than you might imagine. And again, people think of cutlasses as being so small because they think of close-up brawling on ships. But the reality is that the cutlass served a lot more purpose than just fighting below decks. And frequently fighting below decks was actually handled with all kinds of close-up hand weapons, from basically small knives to machete-like weapons to axes and all kinds of things. Whereas the cutlass, it really excels at fighting on deck, where there's a bit more room to play with. It can be a bit cramped on deck, of course, but a lot more room than below decks. And specifically, and this is really, really important, is the cutlass is not just intended as a weapon to be used on board a ship. The Navy served all over. So frequently, ships' crews would have to go ashore for supplies, sometimes to assist with army operations. They would attack facilities on shore. They would do cutting out exercises where you row out from land to take a ship that's at anchor. So there's all kinds of scenarios where you could fight on land and on sea with these, as well as various riverboats and similar basically small ships and boats that were used in shallow waters, which were a lot more open than you'd think of a sailing ship would be. So there's all kinds of scenarios where this sword can be used, and therefore what you're looking at is a very multi-purpose sidearm. So we've just talked about the length, which, as I said, is a lot longer and straighter than people would assume of a cutlass. And the other thing I want to talk about now is the weight, because cutlasses, despite being small, are generally thought of as being very heavy. And it is true that this cutlass, for its size, is quite heavy, but there are reasons for that, and it doesn't feel as heavy as you might think, and we're going to go into that in a moment. But first of all, let's actually find out how heavy it really is. So, 1,030 grams. Funnily enough, that's almost identical to the very heavy 1803 sabre I showed on the first sword study video, which was 1,015. So, just over 1 kilo, just over 2.2 pounds. For a sword of its size, now it's not as short as, again, people think, but it's still a small sword, or a short sword, and therefore that kind of weight is heavy for a sword that doesn't have a pommel. Remember, we talked about this in the last video, is that when you talk about sword weight, it's really important to understand what kind of pommel and guard you're talking about before you look at what the weight really means. So, just over 1 kilo, despite the fact that it is a shortish sword. And that is heavy for its time. So this is in the same weight range as a heavy cavalry sabre, for example. That 1803 I showed in the last video, which was unusually heavy. But it doesn't feel heavy in the hand. And why is that? Well, the reason is that it has this cast iron grip. So at this point, if I just stop and look back at a little bit of the history of these 1804 cutlasses, or specifically what we would call a figure of 8 cutlass. Now, the reason it's called the figure of 8 cutlass is this guard construction. So you can see that it's a very, very simple guard construction, which would have been made in a flat piece and would look like a figure of 8. So very, very simple. And this figure of 8 style of guard goes back to somewhere around about the 1730s. It's hard to pinpoint exactly, but it's roughly around the 1730s, maybe 1740s. And that means that by the time that this regulation 1804 came out, or was introduced, or accepted, depending on your perspective, this figure of 8 guard had been in use throughout most of the 18th century. And the only difference is if you look at pre-1804 cutlasses, they look basically the same as this, but they have two fundamental differences. Is the grip does not have this ergonomic and ribbed shape, and the blade is a little bit lighter. And that means the overall total weight is lower, although they don't tend to balance and handle vastly different. It's basically these 1804s just feel overall a bit chunkier, if you like. And the reason for that is one, the 1804 blades are made to be simply heavier duty, as they look basically the same as the pre-1804 models, but they are just thicker and stronger and more robust. And presumably that was through experience, because if you look at accounts of combat, whether it's on foot or on land or at sea, you'll find accounts of swords breaking all the time, and they particularly commonly break around the shoulder and the fort of the sword here. And this one, like many Napoleonic British swords, has a really thick shoulder. And I suspect they found that simply the pre-1804 models, although a reasonably good fighting sword, were just not robust enough for the job. And let's not forget that we're talking about sailors here, Royal Navy sailors. They're not going to be the most delicate of users, and you've read accounts of them being used. They're often just swinging and slamming them around like they're axes. Now, that isn't to say that they weren't skilled swordsmen by any means, but you'd expect a cutlass used in anger to, well, be used in anger, and therefore susceptible to a lot of damage and breaking. So they beefed up the blade. Now, you might think, therefore, that it's going to handle in an unwieldy fashion because this guard, this figure of 8 guard, is just thin steel. It's not going to add a lot of counterbalance to a heavy blade. And in the pre-1804 cutlasses, the grip was just a round and flat grip. So as in the texture of it is completely flat and the shape of it is just round. It looks like the grip of a hammer, basically. And the way they were made is it had a wooden core and then a flat piece of metal bent around it. And the reason for that is durability, is that these ship's cutlasses, they were hugely susceptible to damage at sea in terms of water and moisture and all these kinds of things. And the fact that also they're not an officer's weapon that one officer takes to war and then goes home and hangs on his wall. A ship's cutlass is expected to stay on ship and have a long service life. So you might expect a ship's cutlass to have 50 years sometimes. It's hard to judge exactly on all of them, but yes, you might expect a ship's cutlass to just be hanging in their stores for 50 years, constantly drawn out and handed to troops to be used over and over and over again, and they have to sustain that abuse. So the early method was to have a wooden core and a flat steel sheet just bent around it, which is cheap and simple and I guess does the job. Although if you look at examples today, they often are very loose and the core is rotted out. But again, that's after a few hundred years. Whereas in 1804, when this cutlass was introduced, so what it really was is it was an acceptance of a previous sword because, as I said, it didn't change radically, but with a few improvements, and that is they beefed up the blade and they provided this new grip. And this new grip does two things. It provides much better purchase, which, let's face it, when you are on board a ship, in terms of you've got water to deal with, you might have blood to deal with in the middle of a battle, you do not want a slippery grip, and a flat round piece of metal is not exactly ideal for that purpose. So this is all nicely ribbed, so nicely textured to provide a much better grip. It is also ergonomically shaped more to the hand rather than just being round, which in the Napoleonic period, or around about the 1780s in British usage, most swords started adopting a ergonomic shape like this rather than the old traditional rounder grips. And the other point here, and this is why it balances the way that it does, is this grip is cast iron, the whole grip. And when you think of counterbalance in a sword, you traditionally think of counterbalance in a sword with a pommel or potentially a heavy guard. But these cutlasses don't have a heavy guard, they never did. The guard is just thin metal. And so this cast iron grip, well, what it's done is two things. It's provided a much more durable grip, which is it's going to last basically forever. And two, has counterbalanced the increased weight of the blade. So it's quite clever. It's a simple and cheap solution to counterbalancing a heavier blade and also providing better grip all at the same time and increasing the durability. And as you can see, this cutlass is roughly 200 years old and it's still a perfectly serviceable fighting weapon today. It's basically unchanged. And now, what that has done, and inevitably adding this much cast weight, has ensured that the balance stays close to the hand, although not excessively so. So, if we now have a look at where this balances, there we go. So the balance point is 11 centimeters. Funnily enough, that's exactly the same as the 1803 that I showed on the last video, which I did say was an unusually close balance to the hand. So again, 11 centimeters, that is typical for a spadroon. 11 centimeter balances make for a nimble sword. So that despite the fact that this is an over 1 kilo sword, despite its small or smallish size, its 11 centimeter balance ensures that it actually is a lot more agile than you might think. The one thing I will mention at this point is this cutlass has been blunted at some stage. Now, that could have been done in service use because it was common within the military to maintain swords blunt until they were needed to be service sharpened to go to war or to any hostile zone. although we don't know much about whether the Navy did that. Personally, I think it's more likely that this was blunted by a collector within the last 100 years, which was very commonly done to make sure that swords were safe to have at home or around children and that kind of thing, because inevitably people, well, especially children, want to touch sharp edges, and so this has been blunted. But it's, as you can see here, the small amount of taper here, it's lost a tiny amount of metal along its edge. So realistically, that's not a lot. That's probably less than 10 grams of actual total weight. So it's not going to radically affect the way that the sword handles today. And you can see the tip is really nicely spear pointed. And yes, you might wonder, if this was in use in 1804, couldn't more British Army swords have used spear points and adopted that? Yeah, well, yes, they could. But let's face it, the Army and the Navy have always gone their own way and done their own thing and thought that they do it better than the other. Anyway, let's now look at the rest of this sword. So we've established the fact that this is an over 1 kilo sword, but it balances at 11 centimeters, which means that it's fairly nimble, and yet it hits with quite a good whack. But also it doesn't feel like it's got a huge amount of mass at the tip, and that's because it doesn't. And the reason is that you can see it has this complex distal taper. So down here at the shoulder, it is really quite wide. It tapers very quickly before it goes into a more even distal taper. And then down at the tip, you can see that, like many British swords of this era, it's actually quite thin, although not excessively so. So if we now look at some measurements for that. So down here at the absolute widest point at the shoulder, 8.5 millimeters. That's a really common measure for British swords of this period. And you can see it tapers really quickly. So here it's already down to 5 mil, and we've only progressed about 5 centimeters along the blade. And then if I go a little bit further along just to here, we're down to 4.8. I move to the rough halfway point of the blade and we're down to 4 millimeters. And if we now look at the tip, is at the last, let's say the last 3 centimeters of the blade, it's down to 2 millimeters, and the absolute tip narrowest point about 1.6 millimeters. So it tapers down distal taper to a fairly thin tip, although not excessively. Remember in the last video I said some British swords went down to 1 millimeter and sometimes even down to about 0.8 millimeter. And also there's no fuller in this blade. So it's roughly 1.6 millimeters there at the tip, and there's no metal reduced through the fullering process at all. And so it has a solid amount of mass in the tip, although it doesn't handle in any unwieldy fashion from that. It's not excessive in any way. So if we now look at the profile taper, now remember I said that it's lost a small amount from the edge, although not very much. It is 3.8 centimeters wide at the widest point. At the middle of the blade, remembering it's lost probably about 1 millimeter of its edge, it goes down to 3 centimeters, and in the last 5 centimeters down to 2.6. So it has a very even profile taper, but a fairly solid amount of distal taper. So yeah, what did I say? It was, it's 3.8 centimeters there down to about 2.5 at the tip. So that's a reasonable amount, and it has lost a small amount from where the edge has been removed. Whereas this blade, it reduces weight mostly through distal taper, because it went down from 8.5 down to 1.5 at the tip. So yeah, this sword has been made agile by having a lot of distal taper and by having this cast iron grip to ensure that it counterbalances nicely. Other features of this sword, well, it has no pommel. It is simply peened over the top of that figure of 8 guard, so that's very simple. The whole hilt, the grip and the guard, is painted black. Sometimes you see this referred to as Japanin, which was a form of heavy lacquer that was done in Europe to try and emulate what was being done in Japan at the time, although it seems more likely that the Navy just used some form of heavy-duty paint, and the reason for that is quite logical, is that you're on board a ship with lots of salt water, you don't want it getting to iron and steel. And so yes, they put a heavy duty paint over all of the grip and all of the guard inside and out. On the blade here you have the crown and the GR cipher, so like when I said on the British officer's sword, that is George Rex, King George. And that is it. So it's not maker marked. Again, that's fairly common for the time. So now to look at the guard shape and the grip length to give you a few more dimensions. So the grip length it's just under 11 centimeters, a whisker under, about 10.8, 10.9 millimeters. The guard width here is 11 centimeters dead on. The depth of the guard, from what you'd call basically what is a kind of a quillen, it's mainly just rolled over for strength on the back there, is also 11 centimeters, and they sure do like the 11 centimeter measure, all things in threes. So yeah, we have grip length of 11 centimeters, the guard width of 11, the guard depth of 11. You notice that the front shell of the figure of 8 guard is a bit smaller and tapers in, as opposed to the this one, which is a bit broader. So if we also measure this one, which is almost more sort of heart-shaped, that's 8 centimeters wide, and that shell is 7 centimeters in height. I suppose I should measure this one as well. That's 9 centimeters in its depth or height. Okay, so you've now got blade measurements, guard measurements, grip measurements, you've got weight and you've got balance, and hopefully that will provide you some idea of how this handles. So, you know, yeah, at a 1 kilo sword for its size, it is fairly heavy, and you do notice it. It's not that light a sword, and yet it's much more nimble than you would think. And it actually doesn't handle so much worse than some of the heavy duty spadroons. When I say worse, I mean the more mass you have going forward, of course, the harder a sword hits, but also the less nimble or less agile it is. So when I talk about good versus bad handling, well, good handling is it's as fast as hell in the hand, whereas of course the faster it is in the hand, the weaker it hits. Those aren't necessarily perfect comparisons, because there are ways you can balance heavy blades and all kinds of things. But overall, yes, it feels like it's got some mass to it, it's going to hit hard, and yet it is not in any way a slow or heavy sword to maneuver. And so these ship's cutlasses, they were in use, as I said, from about the 1730s in a slightly lighter form with the earlier grip. It was accepted in 1804 in this form. In 1814, there was an experimental version that used a slightly different grip in terms of ribbing, although it was still cast, and they used a more curved blade. In fact, not so different to this one I've got here, this training sword, although it wasn't quite as short as that, neither was it as long as this one. It was kind of in between. That one never got adopted, and therefore the 1804 Navy Cutlass was in service until the 1840s, and was finally replaced in 1845 by the 1845 pattern Cutlass. And the 1845 pattern Cutlass is honestly aesthetically slightly different, as a weapon not vastly different. It moved from a figure of 8 guard to a bowl guard. The blade had a small amount of curvature to it, so you could say it was improved for the time in the way they thought they could improve it, but it was not a drastically different weapon to the old 1804 Navy Cutlass. Now, these were purchased and issued to ships in vast quantities. The Navy bought often 8,000 to 10,000 or more at a time of these, and in theory, every man of the crew should be able to be equipped with one of these at a time of need. Although we know from accounts at the time that that wasn't always possible, because let's face it, there are always shortages within the military. But in theory, every man should be able to be supplied one of these, and some captains even wanted the Marines to be equipped with them as well. In reality, again, that didn't really happen, is that they stuck with their muskets with bayonets as their primary weapons. Now, as far as naval combat goes, the Cutlass was at times a sidearm and at times a primary weapon. So when fighting took place on ships, the primary weapons in theory would be the boarding pike and the musket and bayonet, but the pistol and the Cutlass were often primaries for the crew. So you might find some crewmen equipped with boarding pikes, the Marines equipped with muskets and bayonets, but you'd often find the sailors equipped with cutlass and pistol as their primary weapons. And inevitably, they are quite successful in close quarter fighting. They were also issued to sailors when they went ashore for various duties, because inevitably, when sailors go ashore, they're no longer under the protection of the ship, which has natural defence of the sea, and the Marines on board and everything else, and, well, cannon. When they went ashore, they were at risk, and from all sorts, from the enemy, from locals, from theft, from anything. And yes, they were commonly equipped with the cutlass, which would be hung usually from a leather shoulder belt. So yeah, sailors didn't just wear these on a daily basis. They were drawn from stores during battle or going ashore and that kind of thing. And there's also some evidence that some officers did draw cutlasses for fighting as well, because officers had a variety of spadroons and sabres for their own use. And there is some evidence that they might have drawn cutlasses at times as well, because let's face it, it's not the most attractive weapon in the world, and yet it's a very functional one. It has good reach, it hits hard on the cut, it's good on the thrust because it's dead straight and spear pointed, and the guard offers loads of protection. This figure of 8 is as close as a bowl guard that you see later on sabres and cutlasses. It's as close to that as you can imagine, so it has most of the protection that a basket hilt would offer. So not a pretty weapon, but an incredibly cheap to manufacture, reliable, long-lasting, serviceable tool that was more nimble than people would necessarily assume it was. So that's the 1804 Navy Cutlass. Just to give you a comparison on weights, the pre-1804 models I mentioned with the lighter blades and the lighter grips, they usually come out around about 800 grams up to about 900. Whereas these 1804s, you saw mine is just over 1 kilo, and they can push up as high as about 1.2 kilos. So they did beef them up both in the blade and the grip. So that's the 1804 Navy Cutlass. I hope you enjoyed the video. There'll be plenty more coming in this sword study series. Please do subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for watching.